June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers poured across the Soviet border in the largest invasion in human history. The Wehrmacht had crushed Poland in weeks. France fell in 40 days. The Panzer divisions were considered invincible. Their commanders confident, their tactics proven, their equipment superior. Then, on a dusty road near the Lithuanian border, a German anti-tank crew saw something that shouldn't exist. A Soviet tank rolling toward them, low, fast, sloped armor gleaming in the summer sun. They fired their 37mm anti-tank gun, the standard weapon that had penetrated every Allied tank they'd faced. The shell struck the Soviet tank's frontal armor and bounced off like a pebble hitting a cathedral wall. The tank didn't even slow down. It kept coming. Then it fired, and the German position ceased to exist. This was the T-34, the tank that German generals would later call the finest in the world. The design so elegant that captured examples were studied obsessively by engineers who couldn't believe what they were seeing. Sloped armor that made 45mm as effective as 90. A diesel engine that ran on anything combustible. Tracks so wide it could cross terrain that swallowed German panzers. And a 76mm gun that could kill any German tank from 1,000 meters. Over the next 4 years, the Soviet Union would build 84,000 T-34s, more than any other tank in history. And when the war ended, German tank designers admitted what they'd known since that first encounter in 1941. They had been building tanks wrong, and the Soviets had been building them right. Before we understand why German engineers became obsessed with the T-34, we need to understand what tank warfare looked like in 1941. The Wehrmacht had perfected blitzkrieg, using tanks designed for speed and coordination. The Panzer III had a 50mm gun and could move at 40 kilometers per hour on roads. The Panzer IV carried a short 75mm gun designed for infantry support. Both had adequate armor, enough to stop most anti-tank guns of the era. Both had excellent optics, radios in every tank, and well-trained crews. German tank doctrine emphasized combined arms. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support working together. It had worked brilliantly in Poland and France, against British Matildas and French Char B1s, against tanks that were slow, mechanically unreliable, or poorly coordinated. The Germans assumed Soviet tanks would be the same, crude, poorly made, operated by undertrained crews. They were catastrophically wrong. The first encounters with the T-34 sent shockwaves through Wehrmacht command. Field reports described a tank that seemed to violate the rules of armored combat. It was fast, 35 miles per hour on roads, 20 off-road. It had a powerful gun. The 76mm F-34 could penetrate German armor at ranges where German guns couldn't touch it. And most terrifying, it had sloped armor. Not the vertical plates that German and Allied tanks used, but armor angled at extreme degrees that caused shells to recalculate or lose penetrating power. Before we dive deeper into why this design was so revolutionary, take a moment right now to hit that like button. It truly helps us bring more stories of World War II innovation and engineering to light. Subscribe to Skies of Fire for documentaries exploring the weapons, tactics, and technology that shaped history. And drop a comment below. Have you heard of the T-34 before? Do you know why sloped armor was such a game changer? What other World War II vehicles should we analyze? Your support keeps these stories alive. Now let's return to 1941 and discover why German engineers became captivated by Soviet tank design. The T-34's design philosophy was radically different from anything in the West. While German and Allied tanks prioritized crew comfort, mechanical refinement, and precision engineering, the T-34 prioritized 3 things: mobility, firepower, protection. Everything else was secondary. The sloped armor was the most obvious innovation. Instead of vertical plates that absorbed the full force of an anti-tank shell, the T-34's armor was angled at 60 degrees from vertical on the front glacis and 53 degrees on the turret. This meant a shell striking the armor had to penetrate significantly more material than its nominal thickness suggested. The front armor was only 45 millimeters thick, but because of the angle, a shell hitting it had to pass through the equivalent of 90 millimeters of steel, and many shells simply bounced off without penetrating at all. German anti-tank gunners reported shooting at T-34s from close range and watching their shells ricochet into the sky. It was psychologically devastating. Your weapon, which had worked perfectly against every tank you'd faced, was suddenly useless. Worse, the T-34 could kill you from twice the distance you could hurt it. The panic this caused in German infantry units during the first months of Barbarossa cannot be overstated. The 76mm gun was another shock. German tanks in 1941 carried 50mm or short 75mm guns designed for different tactical roles. The T-34's 76mm F-34 was a dual-purpose weapon. High-explosive shells for infantry and soft targets, armor-piercing shells for tanks, and it was powerful. At 500 meters, it could penetrate 80 millimeters of armor. This was enough to punch through the frontal armor of a Panzer III or the side armor of a Panzer IV. German tanks had to close to within 300 meters or less to have a chance of penetrating a T-34. And closing that distance while the T-34 could kill you from 800 meters away was a nightmare. German tank commanders developed tactics specifically for the T-34 threat. Ambushes from concealed positions, flank attacks targeting the side or rear armor, which was thinner, use of the famous 88mm anti-aircraft gun in the anti-tank role, which could penetrate the T-34 from long range. But these were desperate measures. The fundamental problem remained. Tank for tank, the T-34 was superior. Then there was the engine. The T-34 used a V12 diesel, the model V2. Diesel engines were uncommon in tanks at the time. Most used gasoline. But diesel had significant advantages. It was less flammable. A hit to the fuel tank was less likely to cause a catastrophic fire. It was more fuel efficient. The T-34 had better range than comparable German tanks, despite carrying less fuel. And crucially for the Soviet Union, diesel fuel was easier to produce in quantity than high-octane gasoline. The V2 engine produced 500 horsepower. This gave the 30-ton T-34 an excellent power-to-weight ratio. It could accelerate quickly, climb steep slopes, and maintain speed over rough terrain. German panzers, especially the heavier models introduced later in the war, struggled in conditions where the T-34 thrived: mud, snow, rough terrain. The T-34's wide tracks, which distributed its weight over a larger area, meant it had lower ground pressure than German tanks. It could cross soft ground that would bog down a panzer. In the Rasputitsa, the season of mud that turned Soviet roads into impassable swamps twice a year, the T-34 could still move. German tanks often couldn't. This mobility advantage was decisive in many engagements. Soviet tanks could choose when and where to fight. German tanks were often stuck waiting for the ground to freeze, but the T-34 wasn't perfect. Far from it. Inside, it was a nightmare for the crew. The interior was cramped, uncomfortable, and crude. Ergonomics were not a priority. The driver sat in a forward position with limited visibility. The transmission was difficult to operate, requiring a hammer to shift gears in some models. The commander also served as the gunner, forcing one man to handle two critical roles simultaneously. This reduced combat effectiveness significantly. The optics were inferior to German equipment. T-34 gunners struggled to identify and engage targets at the ranges where their gun was effective. The radios, when they existed at all, were often unreliable. Many T-34s in the early war had no radio, forcing them to rely on visual signals or simply following the lead tank. Ammunition storage was poor. Shells were scattered around the crew compartment, increasing the risk of catastrophic fires if the tank was penetrated. The hatch design was inadequate. Crew escape in an emergency was difficult. Survival rates for T-34 crews that were hit were lower than for German tank crews, and the build quality was inconsistent. Soviet factories, especially those evacuated east after the German invasion, produced tanks under horrific conditions. Welds were rough. Parts didn't always fit properly. Lifespan of components was short. A T-34's engine might need replacement after a few hundred kilometers. Yet despite these flaws, the T-34 succeeded spectacularly. Why? Because it was designed for total war, not for individual tank duels in ideal conditions, but for mass production, rapid deployment, and combat under the worst possible circumstances. The Soviets understood something that took the Germans longer to grasp. Tank quality matters less than tank quantity when you're fighting an existential war. A crude but functional tank that can be built in vast numbers is more valuable than a sophisticated tank produced in small quantities. The T-34 could be manufactured by factories with relatively low skill workers. Its components were simple enough that they could be produced quickly. Its maintenance requirements, while high, were straightforward enough that field crews could handle them. And it was cheap. The Soviet Union could build several T-34s for the cost of one German Tiger tank. This industrial calculus was devastating for Germany. No matter how many Soviet tanks they destroyed, more kept coming. By 1943, Soviet factories were producing over 1,000 T-34s per month. The German tank industry, even at peak production, never approached those numbers. German responses to the T-34 evolved throughout the war. Initially, they tried to counter it with existing weapons. The 50mm gun on the Panzer III was upgraded to a longer barrel with better penetration. The Panzer IV received the long 75mm gun, which could finally engage the T-34 on more equal terms. Specialized anti-tank units with heavy guns, like the 88mm, were deployed more widely. But these were reactive measures. The Wehrmacht also captured hundreds of T-34s and pressed them into service. German units operating Soviet tanks praised their mobility and firepower. Reports from the front recommended copying the T-34's design features. And slowly, painfully, German tank design began to change. The Panther tank, introduced in 1943, was a direct response to the T-34. It featured sloped armor, a powerful 75mm high-velocity gun, good mobility. German engineers had studied captured T-34s obsessively, measuring angles, testing armor, analyzing every design choice. The Panther was, in many ways, Germany's attempt to build a T-34, larger, more complex, more expensive, but incorporating the lessons learned from the Soviet design. The Tiger, introduced around the same time, took a different approach. Massive armor, enormous 88mm gun. It could destroy a T-34 from 2,000 meters. But it was slow, mechanically complex, and horrifically expensive. Germany built about 1,300 Tigers during the entire war. The Soviets built 84,000 T-34s. Let's talk about what it was like to encounter a T-34 in combat. Imagine you're a German tank commander in the summer of 1941. You're in a Panzer III, advancing through a Ukrainian wheat field. Your crew is confident. You've destroyed dozens of enemy tanks. Your 50mm gun has proven adequate against everything you've faced. Then your gunner spots movement, a Soviet tank emerging from a tree line. Low profile, sloped front, moving fast. You order your gunner to fire. He aims at the center of mass, fires. You watch through your periscope as the shell strikes the tank's frontal armor and bounces off. The Soviet tank doesn't stop. It rotates its turret toward you with mechanical precision. You order the driver to move, to present a harder target, to close the distance where maybe your gun can penetrate. Your gunner fires again. Another hit, another ricochet. The Soviet tank fires. The sound is different from your gun, deeper, louder. The shell tears through your Panzer's side armor like paper. The interior explodes in fragments and fire. If you're lucky, you die instantly. If not, you have seconds to escape before the ammunition cooks off. This scenario played out thousands of times on the eastern Front German tank crews developed a healthy respect for the Yar, T-34 that bordered on fear. Now, imagine you're a Soviet T-34 commander in 1942. The situation has improved since the disasters of 41. Your tank is part of a unit with radios. You have somewhat better training than the first crews. You're advancing toward a German position. Your driver is good, keeping the tank moving, using terrain for cover. You spot German tanks in the distance. Panzer IIIs or IVs. You know your gun can hurt them before they can hurt you. You order your gunner to load armor-piercing. He's also your loader. He grabs a shell from the rack, loads it, returns to his gun sight. You call the range. 800 meters. He fires. Miss. You correct. He loads again. Fires. Hit. The German tank stops, smoke pouring from the engine deck. Its crew bails out. You feel no satisfaction, only relief. Because even though your tank is better, combat is chaos. A lucky shot could still kill you. You've seen T-34s brew up from flank attacks. You've seen them hit mines. You know the interior is a death trap if you're penetrated. But you also know that for every German tank, there are 3 or 4 T-34s, that your factories are producing tanks faster than the Germans can destroy them. The time is on your side. This grinding arithmetic of attrition was the reality of the Eastern Front, and the T-34 was the tool that made Soviet victory possible. The impact of the T-34 extended beyond the battlefield. It forced a fundamental rethinking of tank design in Germany and later in the West. American tankers who encountered T-34s in Korea were impressed by the design despite its age. British evaluators who studied Lend-Lease T-34s noted the clever engineering. After the war, Soviet T-34s and their derivatives served in armies around the world. They fought in Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, Africa. Some are still in service today. The design influenced post-war Soviet tanks. The T-54 and T-55, which became the most produced tanks in history, were direct descendants. They carried forward the T-34's philosophy, simple, rugged, producible in vast numbers. Even modern Russian tank design echoes the T-34. Low profile, sloped armor, emphasis on firepower and mobility over crew comfort. The idea that a tank should be a weapon first and a vehicle second. This is the T-34's lasting legacy. By the numbers, the T-34's dominance is clear. Total production exceeded 84,000 units between 1940 and 1958. During the war years alone, over 60,000 were built. They equipped hundreds of Soviet tank brigades and corps. They were the primary Soviet medium tank from 1941 until the T-54's introduction in the late 1940s. They participated in every major Soviet offensive, from the defense of Moscow to the drive on Berlin. From Stalingrad to the Vistula-Oder operation. Wherever Soviet tanks fought, the T-34 was there. The Germans destroyed tens of thousands. Soviet tank losses on the Eastern Front were staggering, but the factories kept producing, and the tide kept turning against Germany. Because the T-34 represented something the Germans couldn't match. Industrial capacity, the ability to produce adequate weapons in overwhelming numbers. The willingness to accept imperfection in pursuit of quantity. This was total war doctrine embodied in steel. German documents captured after the war revealed just how seriously the Wehrmacht took the T-34 threat. Heinz Guderian, the father of German Panzer tactics, wrote that the T-34 was the best tank of 1941. Friedrich von Mellenthin, a Panzergeneral, called it the most significant new weapon introduced in the first year of the Eastern Front. Technical evaluations conducted by German engineers identified the sloped armor, wide tracks, and diesel engine as features that should be adopted. Some of these recommendations were implemented in the Panther. Others were ignored due to production constraints or doctrinal resistance. But the fundamental admission was there. The Soviets had built a better tank, and Germany had underestimated their enemy's engineering capability. This realization came too late. By the time the Panther entered production, the Soviets were already fielding the T-34-85, an upgraded version with a larger turret and an 85mm gun. The cycle repeated. German engineering excellence producing sophisticated, expensive tanks in limited numbers. Soviet pragmatism producing good enough tanks in overwhelming quantities. The human side of the T-34 story is often overlooked. The crews who operated them suffered horrific casualties. Soviet training was often minimal. Many T-34 drivers had only a few hours of instruction before being sent into combat. Life expectancy for a Soviet tanker in the early war was measured in weeks. Commanders doubled as gunners, reducing effectiveness. Visibility was poor. Coordination was difficult without reliable radios. And the interior was a death trap if the tank was penetrated. Yet they kept fighting. Thousands of young Soviet men and women, yes women, the Soviets fielded female tank crews, climbed into T-34s, knowing their odds of survival were low. They did it because the alternative was worse. Nazi Germany had made clear that the Soviet Union faced not just defeat, but extermination. Every T-34 rolling off the production line represented a chance to push the invaders back. Every engagement, no matter how costly, was worth it if it delayed or damaged the Wehrmacht. This desperation, this total commitment, was something Germany couldn't match. German tankers were skilled, brave, and well-equipped, but they were fighting for conquest. Soviet tankers were fighting for survival. And that made all the difference. The T-34's production story is as remarkable as its combat record. When Germany invaded, many Soviet tank factories were in areas that would be quickly overrun. The decision was made to evacuate them east. Entire factories were dismantled. Workers, machinery, everything loaded onto trains and moved hundreds or thousands of miles to the Urals and beyond, under German bombs, in brutal winter conditions. Then they were reassembled and production resumed, often in unheated sheds. Workers, many of them women and teenagers because the men were at the front, labored 16-hour shifts. Temperatures inside the factories in winter could drop below freezing. Food was scarce. Conditions were brutal. Yet production increased. By 1942, the relocated factories were producing more T-34s than the original plants had before the war. By 1943, production exceeded 1,000 per month. This industrial achievement, accomplished under the worst possible conditions, was one of the decisive factors in the war. Germany simply could not compete. Their factories were more sophisticated, their tanks more complex, but they couldn't match Soviet output. And in total war, quantity matters more than quality. Today, T-34s sit in museums around the world. Monuments in Russian cities, carefully preserved examples in military collections. Some are still operational. Veterans of battle 70 years past. They look crude by modern standards. Welded steel and rivets. Simple shapes. But the elegance German engineers saw is still there. The sloped armor that makes geometry work for protection. The wide tracks that distribute weight. The low profile that reduces target size. These are timeless design principles. Modern tanks still use sloped armor, still prioritize mobility, still understand that a tank must be producible as well as effective. The T-34 taught these lessons, and the cost of that education, measured in destroyed German tanks and dead German tankers, helped determine the outcome of the war. When those first Wehrmacht anti-tank crews saw their shells bounce off Soviet armor in June 1941, they witnessed the beginning of Germany's defeat. They just didn't know it yet. The T-34 wasn't invincible. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. And there were so many of them, wave after wave, built in factories the Germans couldn't reach, crewed by people who wouldn't surrender. This was the tank that helped save the Soviet Union. This was the design the German generals called the best in the world, even as it destroyed their armies. This was the T-34, crude, brutal, effective, and absolutely captivating in its deadly elegance.